Good evening. It is wonderful to be back in person, and it's great to see all of you here. So I'm Ted Schmaltz, Chair of the Philosophy Department, and I welcome you to the 42nd Annual Tanner Lecture on Human Values at the University of Michigan. President Schlissel will introduce our speaker in a moment, but first I'd like to say a few words about the Tanners and the Tanner Lectures in way of introduction. The Tanner Lectures on Human Values, which is administered by the Philosophy Department, was permanently endowed by Grace Adams Tanner and Obert Clark Tanner in 1978. However, a lecture at Michigan the previous year by the political and legal philosopher Joel Feinberg inaugurated the series. In addition to Michigan, 5 other institutions were originally designated as permanent sponsors of the lectureship. Clare Hall at the University of Cambridge, Brasenose College at the University of Oxford, Harvard University, Stanford University, and the University of Utah. Yale University and the University of California, Berkeley were added as sponsors in 1987, and Princeton University was added in 1988. Over the years, Tanner Lectures have also been delivered at other universities worldwide. The lectures themselves are published in an annual volume. The Tanners had broad intellectual interests. Grace Tanner's interest inclined towards the sciences, especially biology and anthropology. Obert Tanner studied at the University of Utah in philosophy and law. After receiving his law degree, he studied and taught philosophy and religious studies at Harvard University and Stanford University, and was a professor of philosophy at the University of Utah for 27 years. He also was a successful businessman, having founded in 1927 the O.C. Tanner Company, which produces a range of jewelry that businesses use to reward individual accomplishments. An interesting historical note is that this company also produced the medals for the 2002 Winter Olympics held in Salt Lake City, Utah. The Tanners were generous philanthropists. They supported the Utah Symphony Orchestra, Ballet West, and the Utah Opera Company. They also built more than 40 public fountains and established philosophy libraries at 11 major universities and colleges, including our own splendid one here at Michigan in Angel Hall. Over the years, many distinguished intellectual figures have delivered the Tanner Lectures at Michigan, including Sir Karl Popper, Toni Morrison, Henry Louis Gates Jr., and John Rawls. Here at Michigan, it is our practice to take the Tanner Lecture as the occasion for a thorough consideration of its ideas. Each year, we have a program the morning following the lecture in which scholars from various disciplines offer perspectives on the lecture and join in a panel discussion. This year, the symposium will be held tomorrow morning from 10 to 12:30 in the Rackham Amphitheater, which is located on the 4th floor of this building. Our symposists this year are, and I'll introduce them if they'd wave, so Juliana Bididanor of Stanford University, Joshua Cohen of UC Berkeley, and Andrea Veltman of James Madison University. And welcome, and I'm looking forward to the discussion tomorrow. Now to introduce this year's Tanner Lecturer, I'm pleased to present Mark Schlissel, the president of the University of Michigan. Dr. Schlissel earned both MD and PhD degrees from the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and he was the Dean of Biological Sciences at UC Berkeley in 2008, before becoming provost at Brown University in 2011. He became the 14th president of the University of Michigan in 2014, and is the first physician scientist to lead this institution. So I give you President Schlissel.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Professor Schmaltz, for the kind introduction, and Welcome to everybody. I'll share the joy of being here together in person and wish everybody good health. It's great to see students here this evening as well, and we see students all across the campus. It's an honor to be here with all of you for the Tanner Lecture on Human Values and to hear from our distinguished guest, Dr. Kwame Anthony Appiah. Dr. Appiah is an internationally renowned philosopher, author, cultural theorist, educator, and pioneering scholar of African and African American studies. He's established himself as a leading intellectual with his contributions to political philosophy, moral psychology, and the philosophy of culture. Dr. Appiah also engages the broader public to think differently and consider ideas in his New York Times column on ethics. Born in England and raised in Ghana, Dr. Appiah would go on to earn undergraduate and doctoral degrees in philosophy at the University of Cambridge. He taught at the University of Ghana, Cambridge, Yale, Cornell, Duke, Harvard, and can't you keep a job? Princeton, and is currently professor of philosophy and law at the New York University. In 2012, President Barack Obama awarded him the National Humanities Medal for seeking eternal truths in the contemporary world. The citation lauded his works for shedding moral and intellectual light on the individual in an era of globalization and evolving group identities. His writings include prize-winning Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers, which drew praise from former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan. Annan described it as a reasoned appeal for mutual respect and understanding among the world's peoples. Annan added that the author's belief in having conversations across boundaries and in recognizing our obligations to other human beings offers a welcome prescription for a world still plagued by fanaticism and intolerance. Dr. Appiah's latest book, The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity, explores how the collective identities that shape our polarized world are riddled with contradictions. It was named a Washington Post notable book. Many know Dr. Appiah for a different kind of writing. In The Ethicist, his regular column in the Sunday New York Times Magazine, he uses wit and compassion to address readers' real-life ethical dilemmas. Those dilemmas range from the serious and societal, how should I deal with an unvaccinated student, to those better classified as a slice of life, as in, is it okay that my sister secretly records our dad for laughs? Dominic MacIver Lopez, chair of the American Philosophical Association, recently described Dr. Appiah's column as embodying a new model of the public philosopher as confidant and advisor, as well as advocate and explainer. In 2016, Dr. Appiah spoke on 4 central bases of identity: creed, country, color, and culture, and the misconceptions around them in a series of addresses for BBC Radio's flagship Wreath Lectures. The recipient of numerous honors and awards, Dr. Appiah has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. He's also been inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters. On a more personal note, I first met Dr. Appiah in 2017 when he served as a judge in a Campus of the Future student competition as part of our celebration of Michigan's bicentennial. I appreciated his thoughtfulness then and thank him again for sharing his time and expertise with our students. I was pleased to learn he'd be returning to campus for this event. In his lecture today, Dr. Appiah will ask us to more deeply consider the subject of work. It's a topic that each of us has no doubt thought about over the past 18 months as the COVID-19 pandemic has upended so much of our daily routines. I very much look forward to his remarks. Please join me in welcoming the 2021 Tanner Lecturer on Human Values, Kwame Anthony Appiah.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Since I've been hectoring people in my column about wearing masks, I should explain that this is okay because there's 2 rows that have been carefully kept empty there, and I'm a long way away from you. And I think it'll be easier to understand me if I don't have my mask on. Two preliminary things to say. One is, it's not the fault of the department, but that's not what I'm talking about. It's what I told them I would talk about. But when I sat down to actually write this lecture, I found myself thinking about issues raised by the pandemic about work. So I'm going to talk about that. And just so you know, the commentators were given a copy of what I was actually going to say, not this misleading rubric which I invented before I wrote the talk. So anyway, here we go. I think, I should say, President Schlissel, it's great to be back. The COVID-19 pandemic has raised some extremely important questions about work. In particular, it's required us to think about what sorts of work we can or should require in circumstances that expose the workers to risk of contracting what is a serious disease. You might think, as I did when I wrote my first draft of this lecture, that the idea of the essential worker was fit for that purpose. But as Josh Cohen will explain in his response to the earlier version of this talk, which he'll give tomorrow, it turns out that that wasn't a good place to look. That wasn't where this idea came from, and it wasn't really what it was meant for. And I'm embarrassed that I hadn't discovered this for myself, and extremely grateful to him for telling me the right story. So I'm going to offer an account of a different notion that suggested itself to me in thinking about how we should identify the tasks we can reasonably ask people to go on doing in these circumstances. And since the expression essential worker is taken, I'm going to talk instead about necessary work and the people who do it as necessary workers. Necessary work is by stipulation in this talk the work we need to continue in a pandemic, even though it may put the worker at risk. Now, the obvious response to a pandemic is to seek to reduce the rate of spread of infection, to flatten the curve, as we now all say. This allows you to avoid swamping the healthcare system and gives you time to develop treatments and medical prophylaxis, including vaccines. And the more you succeed, the lower the total area under the curve, the total amount of suffering and death. So reducing, to the extent we can, the total suffering and death caused by the disease is what I will call our basic aim. This may seem obvious. Less obvious is that one of the consequences of the disease will be our responses to it, and they may cause suffering and death too. Unless we bear that in mind, we won't be able to assess whether public policy responses are worthwhile in our pursuit of the basic aim. In other words, speaking more straightforwardly, we have to bear in mind that attempts to lower the rate of transmission have costs as well as benefits, including costs that undermine the basic aim. One of the evident consequences of the actions required to achieve social distancing is that it reduces economic activity. If you close supermarkets or canning factories, food production and distribution will decrease unless you provide an alternative. And there are goods that need to be produced and distributed in reasonable quantities, no matter what. Goods necessary because their loss would cause suffering and death of exactly the sort we are seeking to avoid. What matters here is not that people get everything they normally want, but that they get what they need. And need means need not just to remain alive, but to live without suffering. So one task in identifying necessary work is to find out what goods and services are necessary to avoid suffering of the very kind our responses to the pandemic aim to reduce. Now, the way the expression essential work was actually used, it had another function. It was used to identify those who were to be vaccinated first, because it was important enough that they should continue to do their work despite the risks to them and to others posed by their doing so. Thus, in February 2021, the governor of New Jersey, where I've been living during the pandemic, Phil Murphy, identified those who were going to be poll workers in the state's local elections that spring as essential. Without question, poll workers are essential workers, he said, period. He added that as if the thought needed no qualification or explanation. If that's right then, since the conduct of the elections had a tenuous connection to the basic aim, it looks as though an essential worker is just anyone whose work is important enough that it must continue, despite the pandemic-related risks associated with doing it. And the point of vaccinating poll workers was to allow their work to go on with as low a risk as was practicable. This fact reflects an important ethical dimension of thinking about necessary work. We must mitigate, to the extent we reasonably can, the risks it poses to the necessary workers. Presumably, though, as I just said, the governor wasn't claiming that the work had to go on no matter the cost. The election's continuation would not have been deemed necessary work if the poll workers and those who went to the polls had a sufficiently high risk of suffering and death. No one would have said, especially without question, that running an election was necessary work if the costs in suffering and death were predicted to be sufficiently high. Elections are supremely important in a democracy, of course, but what Justice Goldberg said in Kennedy v. Mendoza-Martinez of the Constitution is true of democracy too. It is not a suicide pact. Nor, presumably, are the institutions of democracy so valuable that we should be willing to pay any cost at all to preserve them, to preserve all of them. No one would have suggested that the elections that the governor was talking about, which were elections for school boards and fire commissioners, were necessary work if conducting them safely, for example, would have bankrupted the state. In the actual case, there were lots of financially manageable ways of significantly mitigating those risks, of course, including by the spring of 2021, simply vaccinating participants and requiring voters and those at the polls to wear masks. But the conceptual point is that we can't decide if a form of work is necessary without considering its costs, both financial and human. Even if we're focused on reducing suffering and death, we can't ignore other costs, costs that matter independently of any direct connection to the suffering and death caused by the virus. Still, much of the necessary work that was first identified as such was part of our attempt to reduce the costs, in terms of suffering and death, of being infected with the pathogen. Some workers in the health professions, over the whole gamut from ambulance work to diagnosis and treatment, are doing necessary work in this sense. They're engaged in reducing the suffering and death caused by the disease itself. But others are doing necessary work in responding to health problems that aren't caused by the pandemic pathogen, problems that would result in suffering and death if their treatment were suspended. They are maintaining regular health provision of the sort that cannot be delayed even during a pandemic emergency. And evidently, there is normal medical work that is not necessary work because it can be delayed or because, like so-called optional elective surgery, it is not necessary for a decent life to do it right now. There are many other services, however, outside the healthcare system that need to be maintained if people are not to suffer and die, obviously. I've mentioned the production and distribution of food already. There's also the work of emergency responders in the police and fire services. Some of their responses to the pandemic, most of it isn't. There is the maintenance of a regular supply of electricity, gas, and water, without which, again, in the medium term, people will suffer and even in some cases die. And just to insist on how extensive the connections to the basic aim of reducing suffering are, since all this work involves transportation, the production and distribution of gasoline at some reasonable level of provision must continue as well. So in this case, as elsewhere, what is necessary work is not all the work of some genre, but the amount of that work necessary to achieve our basic aim. Notice that what work is necessary work for the basic aim depends on the nature of the disease, on the health of the population, and on our medical resources. The healthcare system's necessary work depends on what forms of treatment and prophylaxis are available for the pandemic disease. Smallpox vaccination is not necessary work in a population where there is currently no smallpox. The distribution of canned goods is not necessary work in a community of self-sustaining farming people when the local food crops are in season, and so on. So work is necessary relative to a particular pandemic and population and technological capacity, which means you can't define necessary work without knowing about the disease, about available treatments, and about the population's other needs, which may vary across demography and region. So I think a natural way to reflect upon this issue is to adopt what I will call the modest approach. Consider some form of work and some amount of it. Call that the level of that work, of that sort. Ask what the results would be if the work continued at or changed to that level. Focus first on the basic aim. Any level of work that's necessary to achieve the basic aim is necessary work, unless the financial and social costs of doing it deprive us of the capacity to do something more important. If the measure of suffering and death is, say, loss of quality-adjusted life years, then we will have to weigh the gain in quality-adjusted life years over the alternative of proceeding as normal against other things we could do with the money. I've no general answer to how to do that, but if we are to use quality-adjusted life years in decision-making, this is something we're likely to have to try to do anyway. But consider next other central public purposes too, like maintaining our democracy, as the governor of New Jersey aimed to do, or sustaining the productive capacity of our economy. Once again, levels of work that achieve those ends are necessary work if their financial and human costs, like the costs of vaccinating poll workers first, are reasonable. And the costs are reasonable if they don't deprive us of the capacity to do more important things. The basic aim of reducing suffering and death focuses us first on trying to reduce the pandemic's serious medical effects, but the modest approach doesn't require us to ignore every other purpose. Why stop there with a modest approach? Shouldn't we try for each kind of work to find a way of doing it with the largest positive yield? Shouldn't we maximize? The answer is that that would presumably depend, in answering that question, we have to recognize that it would depend on what other work is going on. So if we're maximizing, we should seek to set a combination of levels of work of all kinds with the maximum total value in human and financial terms. And if we were maximizing, we would, in effect, be taking the opportunity provided by the pandemic to do something that we don't normally do, which is to insist that all forms of work are organized to achieve the maximal amount of welfare. But there is, I think, a serious objection to be made against the maximizing approach. It simply requires too much information and too much centralized control. The modest approach takes our current practices as the baseline and assesses levels of work during the pandemic, first on the basis of whether they reduce serious negative health outcomes, and if they do, we ask if we can afford them, which we can if the expenditures on that level of work don't increase overall suffering and death, or something else of equal negative importance. Once we've identified necessary work, you might think that the necessary workers are just those who do it. But that, I think, is a mistake. Because if different parts of the population have different susceptibilities to the disease, and that is certainly the case with age cohorts and the COVID-19 virus, as well as with some pre-existing health conditions and so on, then whether someone's continuing to work is necessary work depends in part, surely, on whether their doing so will significantly increase the likelihood of their own suffering and death, or of their causing suffering and death to others. Non-immune compromised teenagers living in households of young people can be necessary supermarket workers when sexagenarians or teenagers living with sexagenarians are not. But sexagenarians managing emergency calls from home can be necessary workers. There are, in other words, two questions. First, is it necessary that the work be done? And second, is it necessary that it be done by someone like this? If the work doesn't need to be done, there are no necessary workers. But even if it does need to be done, it may be that only some kinds of people need to do it. So necessary work in a particular pandemic is work that's needed in order to reduce avoidable suffering and death in that pandemic. It's a relative, not an absolute notion. Even if work is necessary work, the workers must ordinarily be willing participants, informed of the risks they are taking. This condition introduces an idea that is independent of the consideration whether the work is necessary, which takes account of the willingness of workers to work only through the cost of hiring them. But there are two kinds of ways in which necessary work may be a duty. One is if workers have special skills or preparation for necessary work, and they are needed to carry it out, and their failure to do so would lead to substantial suffering and death. And the second is if taking such risks is a standard incident of their vocation, as it is with medical workers and first responders generally. Often in such cases, there isn't any need for state compulsion, because workers like these have an ethos that goes with their professional vocation. Most doctors and nurses don't need persuading that they had to go to work in COVID-19 ravaged hospitals. We didn't have to force them. That was part of the ethos of their vocation. And of course, compulsion might not produce results of the same quality as sticking with volunteers motivated by a professional ethos. So noting that sometimes people have a duty to take risks for necessary work entails only that it may be morally permissible to compel it, not that it will in general be necessary or even wise to do that. Whether a particular worker is necessary depends then not just on whether their work is necessary work, but also on whether they are needed to do it. As a result, there can be work that's necessary work because, while the benefits in terms of the reduction of suffering and death over the long run are not enormous, the risks to the worker are small. There are many complications here. If nurses are doing necessary work, then providing childcare services without which the nurses cannot do their work is presumably also necessary work. Work can be, to invent a distinction, first order or second order necessary work, depending on whether its products are needed directly or whether it's necessary to enable that first order necessary work. It's easy to see that there is work that is higher order necessary work too, and that the same work may be necessary work at more than one level, as vaccination of healthcare workers both reduces their suffering and death and enables them to reduce the suffering and death of others, so it has both primary and secondary effects. Given that social distancing and isolation can have significant psychological costs, it may be that the overall cost in suffering and death of closing the schools will be greater than that of keeping them open, especially if we are decreasing contacts and increasing ventilation. Children taught solely from home for a year may show significant educational deficits, which in turn may lower expected lifetime earnings in a way that predictably also reduces average expected lifetimes. How should we account for these lost years in deciding what work is now necessary work needed to advance the basic aim? How far out should we look at the consequences? Minimizing the risk to necessary workers is constrained by resources, so how much risk reduction can we reasonably afford? How much of an increase in the deficit is it worth to reduce suffering and death now, given that an increase in the deficit may reduce resources available over the future, including resources for the purposes of saving lives? Thinking about these last two questions might invite a challenge to the sort of analysis I've been sketching. I've focused on suffering and death as the key issues in understanding the idea of necessary work, because I think that that reflects how people have mostly been thinking about this. And this has led us to stress, when looking at consequences, the reduction of harm, and perhaps only one kind of harm, the sort of harm that we go to the medical professions to understand, prevent, and treat. Obviously, some consequentialists might have favored a more straightforward cost-benefit analysis, and that might have led to a different set of policy responses. Just to pick one obvious example, the closure of schools has significantly reduced the quality of life of the typical American teenager over the last year, and may have retarded the social development and the human capital formation of many young people in ways that reduce their future quality of life and perhaps even their lifespans. So the quality-adjusted years of life gained by the elderly from our efforts at disease mitigation may have significantly reduced the quality-adjusted life years of the young. The increased government borrowing as part of the response to the pandemic may well reduce the quality of life of future citizens. What's a fair price and lost opportunities to them for the extended lives of people who are over 60 today, like me? The utilitarians will say that we must try to maximize the net benefits. They will place a value on the quality-adjusted life years in order to make all the costs and benefits commensurable. As is usual with such proposals, part of the problem is that we don't in fact know how to make these assessments and estimate their likelihoods. But that is a problem for me as well, from the sort of approach that I've been, so I can't use it against the utilitarians, though I think it's worse for them. But there's a further puzzle. Whether work is necessary to achieve the basic aim of reducing suffering and death caused by the disease will depend on what other measures we adopt. It requires holistic evaluations. Evidence suggests that some number of people who lose their jobs as a result of the pandemic response, the closure of work, will commit suicide as a result. So that will be a part of the cost of our response. But the numbers here are very likely to be smaller if the government provides income to those facing temporary but fairly long-term involuntary unemployment. So it may be that sending out checks to those people is necessary work, since it's necessary to avoid the suffering and death of suicide. And since it can probably be organized from home, this is necessary work whose costs to the workers can be, in exposure to the virus, can be reduced, though it can't be reduced to zero. So anyone can be a necessary worker of that kind. Given the importance of necessary work, and thus of the people who do it, it's fitting to honor those that do sufficient amounts of it. To honor someone is to treat them as worthy of respect, to esteem them because they rank high in the scale of contribution to some valuable end. The basic aim is itself, of course, a valuable end. And to rank high on the relevant scale is to do work that contributes significantly more than most to that end. We will honor, too, those who risk more than others, whether or not their contribution to the basic aim is greater than normal, because sacrifice in a good cause is worthy of respect. Healthcare workers, even with adequate personal protective equipment, took significant risks in the first stage of the pandemic, when vaccination was not available and the disease was not yet well understood. Even those whose direct contribution to saving lives was small were contributing to something worth honoring. The indirect effects of their actions in enabling the whole healthcare system were substantial. I'm going to come back to some issues about honor again in a bit. So I hope I've said enough now to make it clear that the question, whose work must go on, which has played an important role, must play an important role in responses to pandemic, is actually an extremely intricate one. Indeed, given just the complications I've already identified, you might think that it would have been better not to invoke a concept of necessary work. And there are many puzzles about how to make the concept that I was developing work at all. But more than this, once you see what's involved in thinking about whether work and workers are necessary, you can worry that the identification of a particular job as necessary work is not as helpful as I've been assuming. I suggested that if you were guided by the basic aim of reducing suffering and death caused by the disease, you might end up thinking that teaching, say, a Zoom class was necessary work. But does that really matter? What matters is that Zoom teaching was the best available alternative to in-classroom teaching, and that continuing in-classroom teaching would have led to a great deal more suffering and death. Since the costs to the health of teachers and students of doing it were negligible, that made it worth doing, whether or not it was necessary work. You might think that whether the work was necessary was relevant to determining whether you should honor it. But we should honor what makes an exceptional contribution to a worthwhile end, not just any old thing that does so. And even if online teaching was in some sense necessary work, I doubt it made an unusually high and thus particularly honorable contribution. These issues are important enough in themselves, and I've just scratched the surface of them, but there's a more general set of issues here that this case study illuminates, and I want to turn to that as a sort of second topic. One policy response to the pandemic emergency was to say that no one should be required to do work that was not necessary. Of course, lots of non-necessary work went on. Novelists went on writing their fictions, at least if they weren't too distracted by the anxieties of life under COVID. Architects went on designing. Restaurants operated masked and socially distant kitchens and delivered food, much of which was not necessary. But that was because all this could be done safely without social distancing. What shouldn't have happened was work that was both dangerous and not necessary. You might think that that isn't true, because it was reasonable for many younger people to decide to go on doing work that was not necessary, even if it exposed them to the virus, given the low risk of morbidity and mortality in the young. According to the NIH, 4 out of 5 hospitalizations for COVID-19 in the US have been for people over the age of 65, and people over 65 are 27 times more likely to die of the disease than those under. And this number probably overstates the risk to the young. It's the ratio of mortality, and since young people knew they were safer, they took more risks. We don't know what the ratio would have been if the young had been behaving in exactly the same ways as the old, but it would have been, the ratio would have been higher. But allowing young people to take these risks, if they chose to, would have ignored their role in transmitting the disease. Consider this instructive comparison. Sweden adopted laissez-faire policies and had a very low rate of social distancing, especially among the young. Norway mandated a high rate of social distancing. Sweden, with a population of about 10.1 million, had 14,588 deaths by the end of June. Norway, with a population of around 5.5 million, had just 792. Had Norwegians died at the rate of Swedes, that number would have been 10 times higher. Roughly 10% of Swedes have suffered from the disease in some form, under 3% of Norwegians have. And for what it's worth, the Swedish and Norwegian economies are emerging from the pandemic in comparable shapes. Part of the defense of the Swedish policy was supposed to be that it would be better for the Swedish economy, but it turns out that that wasn't so. not to a significant degree. It may be reasonable to allow people to take risks if the main burden is borne by themselves. It is not when the consequences of defection are largely borne by others. But the lessons I want to take from this little case study are more general. Elizabeth Anson has done a good job of drawing to philosophical attention the question what burdens employers may reasonably place on workers, and has concluded rightly, in my view, that it's not enough to defend our current practices to say that workers are free to leave if they don't like their wages and working conditions. Laissez-faire is not the best doctrine in employment law, as it wasn't in responding to the pandemic. Once you start thinking about work from the point of view of the distribution of its burdens in terms of mobility and mortality, and once you see that those burdens are often borne not just by workers, you will naturally find yourself asking, I think, what such health externalities we can accept. And if you ask that question, you will naturally want to ask how we can remove those that we can't accept. I began by discussing some of the ways we thought about this in the particular circumstances of the pandemic. But now we can see that this is something we should be thinking about all the time. Here, I think, it's important to consider the full range of institutions and decision makers who must face this issue. Like minimizing the cost to workers within an institution, minimizing the negative externalities, the costs imposed on those outside of the institution of a practice like work, evidently requires coordination. One needs to analyze what the combined effects are of many interacting practices, and then see how to organize the whole in such a way as to achieve the aims of the institution while, for example, respecting the basic aim. This is something that those within the institution are better placed to do than outsiders, since they have a grasp of the way its elements interact and what the effects would be of altering the behavior of each of them. You will want the managers and owners of workplaces to care about these questions, and the workers too. But health and other costs borne by outsiders will not automatically reduce the profitability of an institution. So insiders, especially business leaders, often lack the normal incentive to keep track of these effects, which is that it affects the bottom line. Worse, because businesses are generally in competition with other similar businesses, reducing their costs or increasing their outputs by imposing costs on others will be means of increasing profits. As a result, a business that seeks to reduce its negative externalities will be at a competitive disadvantage in relation to those that don't. So there needs to be systems to monitor these costs and direct the business's attention to them, since they have this disincentive to doing so. There are many socially available levers to achieve this. Some require state action, require politics. So, for example, the law can allow those who are negatively affected by an externality to seek compensation for themselves through the courts. But to do that, the state needs to identify what forms of costs to others will be actionable. That can require difficult analysis. Or to give another example, states can make laws or other regulations enforceable by civil or criminal penalties that will penalize those externalities in ways that will discourage those we aim to discourage. But once again, the penalties need to be adjusted so that they tend to discourage the kinds of externalities we want to discourage, and setting the levels here can be hard. A third means of regulation is in the domain of civil society. A campaigning press and active non-profit sector can keep track of and expose the harms caused by businesses and make them pay at least a reputational cost, which may both reduce sales or impose social penalties in terms of disesteem or contempt on the leaders of those businesses, or simply make it harder for them to acquire workers that they want. But a fourth important way of reducing the burdens that businesses impose on others is to establish norms of conduct underwritten by patterns of esteem and disesteem within the world of business itself that create the expectation that businesses will be, as we now say, socially responsible. As the website for the British organization Social Responsibility puts it, employees and customers place a premium on working for and spending their money with businesses that act responsibly and for the benefit of society at large. This is a means of regulation of business that lies in the domain of public culture. This reference to a premium placed by employees on features of the businesses that employ them draws attention to an important general issue here, namely how to assure that work has some of the non-instrumental properties that make it rewarding for those that do it. After all, people typically spend 8 hours or more of each weekday at work and another 8 or so hours sleeping, so it's how many of us spend at least a third of our waking hours. It cannot be irrelevant to human flourishing whether the experiences that take up so much of our time are satisfying. There is a reason that Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights begins, everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, and to just and favorable conditions of work. It seems then far from unreasonable that people should want their work to be something that they themselves draw meaning and self-respect from, and that the workplace should be, where possible, a source of the kinds of valuable human interactions that we politicozoa care about. How then can we ensure the rewards of significance and sociability that are identified as marks of a good job? Once again, as when dealing with health externalities, a great variety of mechanisms can be brought into play. Meaningfulness in work has a variety of distinct sources and components. One is the question whether what you are doing serves some purpose that you value and that is valued by others. That's one place the sorts of employee concerns that the Social Responsibility website draws attention to matter. We derive self-respect from contributions to worthwhile ends, but we also draw social esteem from others. And there's a sustaining interconnection between these two things that is essential to the way that honor works to support practices. The esteem of others is something we value for itself. We are respect-loving creatures, and that is a central dimension of our sociability. But when people communicate their esteem to us, it also confirms our sense that what we are doing is worthy of respect. And self-respect comes from the recognition of what we are and of what we are doing as worthy of respect. Esteem then has an epistemic dimension because it keeps us on track in valuing what is valued by others around us. But as successful business leaders often remark, corporations that pursue and are seen to pursue valuable goals in honorable ways will have an advantage in recruiting talented people to work for them. To put it at its crudest, the premium employees are willing to pay for an honorable job makes them willing to work for you for less. Less crudely, it can reduce a company's search costs, since it makes it more likely that talented people will apply for jobs with it, and that once they find suitable candidates, they will actually be able to recruit them in the competitive labor market. So one reason that it seems crucial to make a concern for the external costs of one's business a legally enforceable obligation is that it means that ascension through such considerations becomes a part of the job. As I mentioned before, without this constraint, there are disincentives to putting one's business at a competitive disadvantage. And one then has to choose between doing what is socially responsible and honorable and what is profitable. Being forced to make such choices is exactly one of the ways in which a job can be unsatisfactory. Decent people don't derive self-respect from engaging in practices that require them to ignore negative externalities that both morality and honor require us to attend to. Some people think that the solution here is simply to criminalize certain practices that impose costs on others and to let others be discouraged by the law of torts. But this ignores a simple but important point. The experts on the possible effects of a business practice are almost certainly going to have to know a lot about that business. They will need to have an insider's knowledge. And as businesses evolve, new forms of such knowledge will be required to make the right decisions. As a result, the criminal law is likely always to be behind here. Take the negative impact of the irresponsible business practices in the mortgage market that precipitated the 2008 economic crisis. To see this coming, you needed to understand what was going on. And maybe most of the people in a position to do that were the bankers who were doing it. Now, maybe now we won't let it happen again. We'll put constraints on businesses that are in the formula too big to fail. But the next crisis is likely to come from somewhere else, somewhere unexpected. As for the law of torts, it too has little deterrent effect, at least in a legal system like ours, when the people harmed are poor or ill-informed, or, as is often the case, both. The result of this is that the expected cost of many bad practices, like putting your workers and customers at medical risk by failing to take the proper precautions, are lower than is needed to deter them adequately. We need workers and managers inside the business to care about these effects. We need their knowledge of the business to be mobilized to anticipate them. But you cannot pay attention to every one of your business's effects. It is one of the central objections to act utilitarianism as a guide to action that it requires us to think about all the effects of each act down to the end of time, thus imposing on us an impossible epistemic burden. So how can we combine the conclusion that there is an important place for those inside businesses in mitigating their negative effects with the recognition that there are substantial limits on what is epistemically practicable? Well, Abraham Kuyper, theologian and former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, developed in the late 19th century the idea of sphere sovereignty, the thought that all the various social spheres, as he called them, each had their own distinctive norms. Here's a quote. "The family, the business, science, art, and so forth are all social spheres which do not owe their existence to the state, which do not derive the law of their life from the superiority of the state, but obey a higher authority within their own bosom." Now, I'm not a Calvinist, but this passage strikes me as expressing a deep and important idea about the organization of moral life, and I aim to persuade you in closing that once it's elaborated a little, it's practically useful. I've been talking about ethics in Aristotle's sense, in the sense in which it's about the good life, but there's another significant way of using the word ethics. It's when we talk about professional ethics, meaning the set of norms distinctive of and developed within a particular profession. They govern you as a member of your profession in matters related to your profession. These norms need not be directly about what you should do. They can also be about what values you should be guided by, or about how you should think and feel about your fellow professionals and the people and the purposes your profession serves. We professors should seek to help our students to develop intellectual autonomy, so a teacher mustn't turn students into disciples. We should respect truth and acknowledge sources in our research. We should treat colleagues according to norms of courtesy that are distinctive of the university, referring to them, for example, by their surnames in speaking to undergraduates. And as this case, professional ethics deals with matters both of greater and lesser importance. This thought is elegantly developed in the Confucian tradition. Mencius speaks of the 5 relationships, parent and child, minister and ruler, husband and wife, older and younger brother, and friend, and he spins out of this recognition an account of the distinctive virtues and obligations of each of these 5 spheres. But those 5, as we've been discussing, are just the beginning. There are many, of course. In each sphere, there are characteristic values to honor, virtues to develop, norms of behavior to follow, and relationships to sustain. And the denizens of each sphere are the experts on all this, recognizing how the relationships and the norms of behavior and the virtues embody the values. The profession learns over time how all these elements, the values, virtues, relationships, and behavior, fit together because they need to evolve as the surrounding social and technological context of their profession changes. For teachers over the last year, ideas about how to handle remote teaching have developed new norms. May we require students to turn on their videos on Zoom, for example? Notice, by the way, before proceeding, that the focus on necessary work was an example of this kind of separation of spheres. The task for businesses and governments was to take decisions about which work must continue, given the way that work is currently organized. It was not to think about what would be, all things considered, the best thing that each person should be doing at work. But now it is reasonable to ask, why do the distinctive spheres have distinctive norms? And the beginning of the answer is that each profession has its own distinctive functions. And to serve those purposes, a profession, like any institution, has to focus. One cannot be an expert at everything. An institution, like a person, has to think about the consequences of its existence and its practice. But it cannot, no one could, predict all the consequences of everything it does. We set limits, therefore, on how its general practices should be regulated. So, for example, any business is likely to be housed in buildings which will have all the effects of any building. They will consume energy, block and reflect light, release waste. If it does these in ways that interfere with the business's distinctive central functions, its workers and managers will have to make special effects to work out how to mitigate those effects. But otherwise, the obligations they have as building owners are no different from anybody else's. They don't have to think about all the consequences, all the ethical consequences of the existence of their building, as nobody does. Nobody has to do that. The general answer then to the question why the different spheres have different laws is that it's not possible to consider every consequence of every move you make or think about everything that matters all at once. And so we bundle together packages of concerns and ask people within an institution to focus on having the knowledge and skills necessary to meet a manageable package of purposes. we practice an institutional division of labor. One way to put this is to say that ethical life, the business of deciding what we want to be like, how we should act and feel, what we should care about, is modular. The answers to those questions are answers that depend on defining a context. Am I here acting as teacher or uncle, citizen or family member, manager or employee, client or friend? So it's important then, contra the inclinations of, I think, too much modern moralizing social media, to assign issues to their proper and distinctive spheres, and to give them, in each sphere, their proper weight. The modularity of ethics means that if you're a surgeon, your task is not to decide whether the world would be better off if the person under your knife were to perish. If you are a defendant's attorney in court, your role is not to seek justice by hiding exculpatory evidence, whatever you think of your client's guilt. If you're in charge of a nurses' union, you cannot make your first directive the containment of our nation's healthcare costs. All of which is to say that we have role-specific obligations that are separate from the views and values we may have as private citizens. Maybe in the world of business, thinking about the negative consequences of the uses and the likely misuses of your products and the distinctive external health impacts of your practices should be a role-specific obligation. That is more than many businesses think about today, but it is less than everything. There is much to be said, naturally, and Josh will say some of it tomorrow, about the limits of ethical modularity. Sphere sovereignty is relative, not absolute. Taking account of modularity structures our ethical situation. It highlights the way our roles in life, professional and social, must shape but also limit our responsibilities. Abraham Kuyper, a deeply religious man, himself struggled with how to reconcile art as a realm unto himself with what he considered the necessity of bringing it in submission to God. He concluded that, quote, religion and art demand an independent existence, and the two stems, which at first were intertwined and seemed to belong to the same plant, now appear to spring from a root of their own. A similar thought applies, I think, to the passionate political values people may have as citizens on the one hand, and on the other, the responsibilities, custodial and scholarly and educational, that they have as stewards of businesses. To resist a totalizing conflation of all our spheres of value is not to dilute the ethical commitments we all must shoulder, it's just to affirm them in their full complexity. Thanks very much.
Cool, yeah, thanks so much for the talk. Really enjoyed it. I imagine I won't offend anyone if I say, during the pandemic, I don't think my research in philosophy of science was necessary work. So, maybe some aspects of teaching, very important, but there's definitely, to me it seems, a sense in which if I had stopped doing my philosophy of science research and done something that could have really helped out with the necessary work, that would have been more meaningful. I take it that the spheres that we have, they come and go. One, might have to argue for the preservation of a certain sphere in a certain context. Do you think that I had a duty to do something different than my philosophy of science research during the pandemic?
I think, so no, I don't. I mean, you had duty to do some things during the pandemic that you don't normally, like wear masks, get vaccinated as soon as possible, keep distance from people. You had lots of general duties. But I don't think, your question is really, did you have a duty to take up some other occupation? Whether, if it had, in the particular circumstances of this pandemic, I don't think so. Of course, there are emergency circumstances in which we may have a duty to take up an occupation that isn't our normal occupation. That can happen in wartime. And does happen regularly in wartime. People do their war work. Freddie Ayer spent the war trying to break German codes. He didn't go on perpetuating logical positivism. But I happen to think that given, so this is partly just a development of the point that what's necessary depends on exactly on the nature of the emergency, as it were. And in this particular emergency, I don't think there were occupational shifts that were required of people in your occupation. Do I think that it might have been an honorable thing to take up some, if there was a need for it? I mean, suppose the ambulance services in your area had been, I mean, this doesn't happen in a place like Ann Arbor, but the place in New Jersey where I live, the ambulance service is volunteers, because it's a town of 2,000 people, so we don't have a professional ambulance service. If I discovered that a bunch of people, the people who normally do that work were, for example, ill, and if I'd known how to do it, which I don't, it might have been a very good thing for me to show up and volunteer to join them. I'm not saying that that isn't true, but I don't think you had a duty to shift occupations.
Cool. Thanks very much. Yeah, I hope you're right about that.
Thank you very much for your talk. I had a question mainly about conflict and error in the aim and the spheres of occupational duties. So my thought was, for example, in the Weimar Republic, lots of crisis going on, was a troublesome time. And some occupations interpreted their duties maybe in a different way in light of this crisis. So a classic example in German history would be that many lawyers and judges would think it to be part of their occupational duty to keep up order and discipline and defend the state. Now that led them to crack down very hard on left-wing activism and to be very lenient towards right-wing activism because they saw them not as enemies of the state in the same way, right? Now this was an error, obviously, in maybe interpreting their duties with like huge negative effects. I wanted to ask you how we would treat such errors, how we can detect them, and how we can like correct them from the outside if they don't self-correct within.
Good. Look, this is a very important question about how one should think about one of the points I was making, which is that judges and lawyers are experts on the, in this particular case, and the point is general, are the experts on, have a reasonable claim to be experts on the impacts of behavior of judges and lawyers on the things that the law is supposed to protect. So, in acting in that way, they were acting in accordance with what I call the professional ethos. They were acting within a sense of what it was socially useful for their profession to be doing, but that was specific to them. They didn't have to join any of these parties. They didn't have to, in their capacity as judges and lawyers, they just had to pay attention to the things. Now, the important point that you're making is that when professions define their professional ethos and talk about their professional ethics, it's perfectly reasonable for outsiders to ask the following question. If they proceed with that ethos, will they, as a profession, be serving the purposes that we'd like that profession to serve? Not they would like that profession to serve, but we, generally speaking, would like that. And that's why, for example, we want civilians involved in discussions of medical ethics, non-doctors. We want, because it's just a feature of the way people are. It's a feature of the way I am, just to be clear. I'm not excluding myself from this criticism. That it's very easy to think that something's the best norm for your profession because it actually just in the interests of people like you that norm should be established. So we should not be uncritical of the norms that develop within these professional, this kind of professional ethos. And moments can come, and maybe a pandemic is a good one, where our focus on the attention of the focus of our attention on some features of the way the ethos has developed can lead us to think, not just in the pandemic, but more generally, that we've got something, the people who are the experts here, have gotten something wrong. I was mentioning to some people earlier that it turns out, for example, that in Costa Rica, a country much poorer than ours, this is stuff that Atul Gawande published in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago, it turns out that in Costa Rica, the way they manage their healthcare system, it's a much poorer country than ours, and they spend much less on healthcare per capita. The way they run their healthcare system, they have a longer life expectancy than Americans, and more equally importantly, the differences in life expectancy by class are minimal. Your life expectancy in Costa Rica, if you're a poor person in the rural areas, is not much different from your expectation if you're rich and living in a city. That's a very considerable achievement of a healthcare system, so it seems to me. Both of those things, both the distributive feature and the overall high number for life expectancy. Learning that, I think that one reason why people are interested in that right now is because the pandemic has drawn attention to the ways in which our healthcare system has very disparate impacts by race and class, especially by class, but certainly by race as well. And some of the racial differences are the result of the correlation between race and class, but not all of them are. There are independent racial sources of inequality. So, we should think about that. And the fact that that is true, and the consequence of the way that our health care system works, means that we have reason to wonder whether doctors and hospitals and public health officials are thinking about the right things and thinking the right way about those things. And in that topic, in that conversation, we should be demanding things of them, and that is, we shouldn't leave it to them. I'm not saying we should leave it to them. But once we have these conversations and think about how to reshape the norms, those norms will still be modular. We won't be asking hospitals to think every time they do something about every possible consequence, every possible morally relevant consequence. We're going to be giving them a manageable package of things to pay attention to. Maybe they're not paying attention to things, and this is true of these German jurisprudence. They were not paying attention, as you think and as I think, to the right things. But they had to pay attention to something, and they couldn't pay attention to everything. And designing, say, a business ethics, a set of norms for the behavior of a corporation, or a professional ethics for teachers, nurses, doctors, lawyers, and so on, is a matter of, as it were, making things that are both distinctive to people of that sort, but also manageable and attentive to the main things that people doing that thing should be attentive to. But we can't ask them to be attentive to everything. And in particular, it's just wrong when a judge takes a decision thinking only about the overall effects of what that decision will be. The job of a judge in our kind of legal system is to decide a case within the law. That leaves you a broad range of discretion, as we all know, but it's not an infinite range of discretion, and that's and if you don't like that, you shouldn't be a judge. You should do something else, like become a civil rights activist, for example, if you don't like that. But that's the job of the judge, I think. And so they did it wrong, but that they did it in the sort of way that they did wasn't wrong.
Thank you.
My view.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering what you thought about descriptions of the work that healthcare workers did as heroic. So I know that it was talked a bit about, in the philosophical community at least, a kind of tension between, on one hand, feeling like that was a correct description of a lot of the risky work healthcare workers were doing, with kind of the fact that that work seemed necessary, and the word heroic often implying like that the act was supererogatory or something like that. So I was kind of wondering what you thought about the use of heroism in a lot of the descriptions of the work that people were doing, the necessary work people were doing during the pandemic.
It's a good question. I mean, I think I'm not super keen on heroes as a concept, a moral concept, because it has its roots in. Sorry, I'm not super keen on using it everywhere, because it has its roots in a particular kind of context, which is military context, where heroism characteristically does involve acts of supererogation. I mean, ordinary soldiers are doing brave and dangerous things all the time because it's their job. The people who get the Medal of Honor are doing more than that. They're doing things that they didn't have to do, that they could. I mean, of course, that's not characteristically. People who get the Medal of Honor don't think like that. If you said to them you didn't have to do that, they'd say, "But what do you mean? Of course I had to do that." They feel compelled to do what we think of as supererogatory. That's part of the sort of psychology of that kind of person. Now, lots of doctors have done things. Lots of medical workers, not just doctors, have done all kinds of supererogatory things in the course of the pandemic, and I think that's true. I mean, and lots of them have done, as it were, more than they signed up for, even though what they signed up for was doing this job even in these circumstances, and they went on anyway. They didn't stop, and maybe that was supererogatory. Maybe even if the job demanded it, they were morally free to think that they hadn't agreed to those demands. I don't know. So there may have been a lot of heroism in the sense of acts supererogatory to a high degree, not just, as it were, mildly supererogatory, but massively supererogatory. And in particular, again, from the military context, we think that it's particularly appropriate when the person takes a huge risk. Not just, it's great, maybe many of them worked longer hours than they needed to. But that wasn't the thing that was heroic. That was very decent and admirable, but the heroic thing was putting themselves in harm's way more than they had to.
Yeah.
So I think you can take the notion of hero out of the military context and sort of apply it, but I suppose part of my point is that healthcare and warfare are very different spheres, and I'd rather use language that recognizes that, and the language of heroism somewhat invites us to think about it in the wrong way. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
It's a great question.
So we have people at both, and I'll go ahead here, and then we'll alternate.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me just fine?
Yes.
Okay, so it seems to me that as a large part of your talk that when you're trying to sort of figure out the roles and the expectations of a particular profession, the value considerations that are guiding are the minimization of suffering and the sort of like basically lowering the curve and all that, which is of course important and should be primary. But I'm also wondering if there might be other value considerations that could guide sort of deliberation about what is expected of a particular role, a particular profession or vocation. So for example, I'm thinking if you're an artist of a certain kind, you might be expected to give something that distracts people when they're stuck at home and don't really have much to do or much to think about. Or if you're a religious figure or something, you might want to consider giving people something to appreciate for its own sake and sort of other considerations than just the minimization of suffering. So I'm just wondering if you think that's a fruitful way of also thinking about figuring out the ethical sort of roles that we could all play in a pandemic.
Good. So, yes. I was thinking about questions that arise for people trying to make policy about whom to require to work and whom. That's a very narrow range of questions. You're raising a perfectly legitimate set of questions that arise for each of us about how, given our vocation or given our profession or work, we can make contributions in this kind of health emergency, or indeed in any kind of emergency. You can imagine, similar issues arise for artists in New Orleans after Katrina or whatever. That there are things that your preparation distinctively enables you to contribute, and in those circumstances, it seems perfectly reasonable to say to people that it's worth spending a bit of time thinking about whether there's something you can contribute. I think most artists would resist your thought that their job is to distract us. I think they would think that one thing that art can do is to help us think more deeply about our situation, and that's not quite the same as distracting us. But certainly, some of the people engaged in some of the arts, like television, are not claiming to be doing deep art of that sort. They are claiming to amuse us, and in the world of social distancing, that kind of amusement got to be extremely important. And so it was a very good thing that people did it, and did it in a way that was attentive to those circumstances, that is, that addressed. That all seems right to me. Not sure that anything I've said yet amounts to declaring a duty to do anything. That's a friend of mine who's just got back from Senegal. So I'm not sure that you were pushing in the direction of suggesting that we might have duties of this sort. I'm persuadable, but so far I haven't said anything that I think has that strong a conclusion.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, cool. So I'm really intrigued by the account you give of not just necessary work, but also the necessary worker. And I was just wondering your thoughts on how to distinguish who is actually necessary among a similarly situated class of people. Like, presumably there are, like, innumerable teens living without their grandparents who could work in a grocery store or things like that. And presumably not every single one of them is necessary. So how might you determine, both from a policy level and from a moral level, who to make the sacrificial lambs per se in this situation?
Good. I mean, where there's a whole bunch of people who are equally situated and could serve the role better than other people who are more endangered, say, because they're older or sicker, or have pre-existing health conditions and so on, then it seems to me it's natural to think that the task is simply to open the task to those people, and not to open it to the ones who would be endangered, and to if not enough of them volunteer for some reason, and you have two things you can do. You can offer them more money. You can increase the incentives, including not just incentives for money, but honor. You can point out to them that they're making a contribution and get them to think rightly that they're doing something helpful. Or you can, if it's really necessary and you can't get the people, you can conscript people, and probably the right way to do that in these circumstances is to identify people equally placed who are necessary, some of whom are necessary, and do the rest by lottery, I would think. But a lot of the work that needed to be done had lots of people who could do it safely, or moderately safely. And so we couldn't ask all of them to show up. We didn't need all of them. Then you have questions about, as I say, in general I favor incentives, including non-monetary incentives, rather than coercion. But again, thinking about the case of warfare, sometimes you just have to, if you don't need them all, you have to have a lottery, as we had with conscription during the Vietnam War. Everybody had to sign up, and then there was a lottery system for deciding who actually had to serve, because we didn't need them all.
Okay, thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I wanted to ask you a quick question about, it's a question about the contingent makeup of the American workforce and its relationship to whom may be conscripted by the state to take up necessary work. So it's just sort of, descriptively true of a lot of what I take to be necessary work under your account. That, care workers are overwhelmingly women, predominantly, women of color, that people in grocery stores and in factories are predominantly poor. But also those are skilled jobs. It's not just easy to replace somebody on a factory line. And so a thing that I was thinking about was that when those people are given the term necessary worker, then those health burdens that they face might in the aggregate overwhelmingly burden already marginalized groups in the United States. So I was wondering how you thought those aggregate risks might relate to the account of work conscription or the obligation to take up necessary work.
I mean, that's, so, I mean, a lot of the things that have happened during the pandemic reflected injustices in the way burdens are distributed generally, independently of the pandemic, and sometimes might have accentuated those inequalities, or certainly, as it were, built on them. And I think this is one of those cases where sort of thinking during the pandemic should make you think about the more fundamental long-term problems of inequality. I don't know what I think about exactly how to handle those problems in the emergency. I do think that, as I said, that in general, if you can do these things without coercion, without requiring people to do things under penalty, it's better to, and that very often you can. And you can do that by creating incentives, which are not always financial. But I'm, I guess I'm worried about the thought that the epidemic is the right time to spend a lot of energy on putting right these longer-term structural problems, in part because of the epistemic point that it's hard to figure out how to identify who the people are who end up facing these dangers as a result of the underlying unfairness of the overall system, and also hard to figure out exactly what to do about that. As you said, many of these people are they're skilled, and so you can't. They're not substitutable. You can't say, we'll put the burden on somebody else, or we'll put the burden on volunteers or something, or on conscripts, or on people picked by lottery, because in the context of the emergency, we don't have the time to train people who aren't already experts. So I think it's a hard question, and you're essentially, I think, pressing the point that if you stick with the normal way of going on, the normal way of going on has inequalities built into it, and I agree with that. But in the long run, it seems to me, I know what I think about the long run. In the long run, we should take the opportunity provided by noticing these things to think about how to organize the overall system in a way that those inequalities disappear. or we can't just make, we may not.
Great, thanks so much.
That's utopian, but reduce them significantly.
Great, thank you.
And I think I think the emergency has provided us with occasions for thinking about these things. I think, and you're raising them because the emergency has drawn them to our attention, I think.
Thanks for your talk. So I remember listening to stories at the beginning of the pandemic of healthcare workers who were placed in positions where they both had to take on the costs of actually caring for people, and in so caring for people, set precedents that they knew would shape public policy decisions. And I thought of that as, it seemed unfair to me at the time, and one way to make sense of that unfairness is that they were asked to kind of take on two modes at once in a way that was unjust to them. But when I started thinking about who should take on this mode instead, I felt a little bit of tension with this sphere sovereignty, because it seems like the very people who have the expertise are those who are actually doing the service work and doing it on the ground, and that any time that we ask someone else to do it, say a philosopher or a biomedical ethicist who doesn't have any of that experience of actually trading off ventilators, we lose something in terms of the expertise and the responsiveness and efficiency of the sphere. So I was wondering what you thought about that trade-off and tension.
I didn't hear everything you said at the start. So what were the two, you said the as it were, two burdens were imposed on people. I didn't hear what they both were.
Yeah, so on the one hand, the healthcare worker had to take on the burden of risks to their life and the suffering and death and the risks of the disease. And on the other hand, they knew in the actions they were taking, they would be setting precedents that would inevitably shape public policy, and they had to sort of shape those policies themselves in a way that was very challenging for many healthcare workers.
So, in other words, the second burden was a burden of, was a kind of, as it were, cognitive or epistemic burden. It was a burden of forcing them to think about.
Not just forcing them to think about it, but being the ones who are responsible for making that decision and bearing the sort of costs of that as well.
So the costs were the psychic costs of feeling responsible for what happened as a result of decisions you made.
Yeah, and whatever other costs we think public policy
I see.
decision people have to take on.
Well, I mean, that is something where conversations with medical ethics boards would have been very helpful for people. I think one of the functions of those things isn't just to get medical staff to make better decisions, it's to share the burden of coming to the right decision. And one reason why you feel better about a decision made that way is you think it's more likely to be the right decision if you've consulted people whom you respect and who have thought about things with you. So, so there was a mechanism to help, but you're right that at a certain point, these people had to do things. They were faced with patients that they had to decide how to treat, and that imposed upon them, this extra burden. But as you said, I'm not sure who else. I mean, we can, as I say, we have mechanisms for helping with that. That's what medical ethics boards do. And as I say, their function isn't just to help make the right decision, it's to share the burden of making the decision, I think. And we should do that, because in life and death situations, it's a great burden. It's not just the burden of setting policy, it's the burden of dealing with the particular case is also burdensome if you have to make hard choices. And all of that is stuff that it can be helpful to have, thoughtful people who've thought about similar cases. So that's a place where actually the bioethicists would be useful. Not only bioethicists, but among other, because it's good that these discussions are not held just by bioethicists, they're held by doctors who face similar, and doctors and nurses who face similar choices, and by rabbis and priests and so on, all sorts of people who have a role to play, I think, in this double task of improving the quality of the decisions, but also sharing the responsibility for the outcome.
Excellent, thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you for your lecture. Earlier you spoke about how a high risk to others might override other motivations for a low risk to self activity. It seems to me that divisions on this point, coupled with or underpinning concerns about bodily autonomy, really drove the way that different communities around the country, community level and state level, responded to the pandemic in terms of who is working and what businesses are deemed essential or necessary. At what point, if ever, should we resume to think about, should this concern about risk to others versus low risk to self, when should these things equalize again? When should other motivations perhaps supersede, where now in this state of emergency, the high risk to others is overriding this low risk to self?
So is the question about what it is about the risks in this kind of emergency that means that people have specially strong obligations to weigh the interests of others more significantly against their own interests than they normally do? Is that sort of the issue?
Sure, and also the way that there are perpetual risks that we may have never been aware of that we take because they pose a low risk to us, but might pose a great risk to the cancer patient on the bus or whatever the other, those. We've been forced to think about the ripple effect of our decisions in terms of risk to others, though not everyone has done so equally or to the same extent. When, if ever, should those who have done a greater degree of considering the risk to others return to a state where they do not?
If you're talking about, as it were, citizens, not people occupying roles in healthcare institutions and so on, but just citizens, I think you should always, if you know that a decision you're making risks being a cause or part of the cause of serious harm to another person, if you know that, that's always a reason to weigh that consideration against your own interests. What's happened is that a bunch of those sort of patterns of causality have been made visible and salient to us. So people have not gotten vaccinated, gotten sick, filled emergency rooms, and made it impossible for the emergency rooms to treat people with late-stage cancers because they don't have the resources to do everything, and they have to make choices. We're all the time making choices about our behavior in the sphere of our health, which can have consequences of that sort for other people. And in general, when you take a risk, especially in a society which has a lot of systems of insurance, you are raising the costs to other people. I mean, if you drive around on your motorbicycle in a dangerous way, eventually enough of you doing that and the costs of insuring motorbicycles goes up. And so it's not just a matter for you how you drive your motorbicycle, because we're all connected in those ways. Now, the healthcare case, as I say, it's become visible, salient, because we've heard these stories about the necessity. This week it's Idaho, the necessity for rationing. That rationing doesn't just affect the treatment of COVID, obviously. It affects everybody. And so it's the case that not so much that each person who declined to be vaccinated has caused some detectable harm, but that people who've chosen not to be vaccinated have together caused serious, large harm. I mean, harm on the scale of tens of thousands of lost lives that wouldn't have been lost if everybody had taken up the opportunity to be vaccinated when it was given to them. And this is one of those kinds of cases where what a group of people together do is very bad, but what each of them does is hard to assign any direct causal effect. And this is, of course, the pattern that explains why we're destroying the environment. It's very hard to assign responsibility to any particular driver's exhaust for anything serious, but the effect of everybody ignoring that is disastrous. I think in those circumstances, we should use the law as a mechanism of coordination. We should say, we're going to require everybody to do as much as is reasonably required to avoid this terrible outcome. So I have no problem with requiring people to get vaccinated, nor do I have any problem with requiring people not to use cars that are emitting above a certain amount. And that's true even though each person who doesn't get vaccinated can reasonably say, well, I don't prove that I'm doing any harm. Show me the harm that I've done. And each person who emits can say the same thing. They can say, show me the harm that I've done, and you can't show it to them. Sometimes because it's literally the case that the marginal effect of what they've done is nothing, zero. But often because it's just an epistemic problem, we can't say for sure. If we were God, we could tell them, but we're not, so we can't. But as I say, in those cases, it seems to me the right thing to do is to identify a set of rules that are sufficient to avoid the bad outcome and require everybody to conform to them. In doing that, we face problems of the sort that the last person at that microphone raised about how to do that fairly. So we should bear in mind that we will face problems of that sort. This is true, obviously, in the case of environmental challenges. We've got to figure out, there are lots of rules we could make which would solve the problem, but they're different and they have imposed different costs on different people. Which one should we adopt? Well, there may be issues of fairness there, but there also may just be choices we have to make.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much, and thanks for taking all of our questions. My question kind of relates to that, and you might have just answered it a little bit, but my question is about different perceptions of what is real and what isn't, because I feel like that's become a huge issue during this pandemic, is a lot of people believing that COVID is real or it isn't, believing that vaccines work or they don't, and feeling very justified in those beliefs, or believing even that by not getting a vaccine, they are actually preventing harm, right? Whereas your arguments, and I believe, a lot of us believe, by getting a vaccine, we are preventing harm of others. So my question, I guess, is just, how do we speak to one another and work on these issues when we have different understandings of what reality is? And that's an issue that I've come up against. I've worked as a necessary worker throughout this whole pandemic. And I've had coworkers who have not seen the pandemic as real, who have not seen the threats, and not understand the harm that they could cause our little community in our workspace. And how do you speak across that difference, I guess, is my question. And how do we work to all be in the same reality, you know?
So if I had a clear and short answer to that question, I would have a big book contract from somebody to write about it, because it is the problem. It's not just a problem about the pandemic. It's the problem we face in our democracy, isn't it? But one thing we can say, I think, is something about the sort of etiology, the causal processes, the social processes that produce a situation in which people have very different views about what's going on. Not about what should go on. There's also a social etiology of that, but about what is going on. And it's always been the case in large-scale human societies that there were significant subpopulations that had a very different view of reality from the normal view, right? I remember, my sort of way of remembering this is that there was somebody asked a bunch of people in England, I think in the 1960s, who the Prime Minister was, and some people said Mr. Asquith. Now, Mr. Asquith had been dead for a very long time, but there were still people who thought he might be Prime Minister. So, you know, there's, the literature on political knowledge suggests that lots and lots of people always, everywhere, have surprisingly divergent views from, as it were, the standard view. So I do think that situation is exacerbated by two features of our current situation. One is the ease with which you can slide into an epistemic subnetwork of the network of epistemic networks, in which you can sort of get any picture you want reinforced. If you're in the right Facebook groups, you can get support for almost any view, and that's one. And this was always possible in small groups, but Facebook groups can be quite big, and they can be coordinated in a way in which small groups in villages across the country were hard to coordinate in the past. So they sort of get consilience, they gather. That's one problem. The other problem, this may not apply within your group, but another problem is that beliefs are both, the expression of beliefs is both a sign of membership in certain identity groups and a sort of test of loyalty to those groups. And if the groups matter to you, being loyal to them matters to you, and not breaking with the team view matters to you. And of course, because it's a belief, you can't literally say to yourself, you can't literally say to yourself, I must believe that P, so I believe that P. That's not how it works. But it's pretty easy to find ways to get yourself to believe P without directly saying to yourself that that's what you're doing. Self-deception, though philosophically puzzling, is a perfectly standard thing. And so people do a lot of that in order to maintain, on the topics that matter for identity, whatever the standard view is of people of their identity. So anyway, that's some remarks about how I think some of this is to be explained. Yeah. That explanation doesn't make it very easy to figure out what to do about it. Because these identities do matter. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with the mattering of political identities, I don't think. There is something wrong when they do this damage to the epistemic situation of their members. I mean, someone who's in a network that's currently committed to the view that there is no virus is damaged by that fact. Their capacity to protect themselves and to look after themselves and their families is reduced, and so they are suffering from their membership in that network. And they're suffering a harm. How we mitigate those harms, I think, and one of the reasons it's a hard problem is because we're worried about two questions. Who gets to decide how to manage the epistemic networks that are doing wrong? So people don't like the fact that, Facebook and Twitter corrects people. They say, who are they to say? And the answer is they have highly paid people well, not highly paid people, they have paid people whose job is to look into it and ask experts and then say. But there is an answer to the question, who are they to say? But many people don't like the fact that they do so. And especially, I think, many people don't like it if you propose that the state should do so. And there's a reason for that, right, which is historical worries about giving the state that kind of power. Not because the state isn't going to be able to exercise it, but because it won't necessarily exercise it for the purposes for which they were given it. They'll exercise it for other purposes, namely to protect the reputations and the positions of people who hold positions of power. So it's a hard problem.
Yeah.
So I haven't said anything useful, except some things about what I think is going on. I'll say one more thing about this, which is that it's an important point that people don't just have political identities. They have lots of identities. And it may be that some of the cross-cutting their identities they have may allow them to communicate with people who don't share political identities in ways that might allow some communication about this. The way to persuade someone to at least entertain the possibility of not holding one of the views that is now standard for their, as a signal of their membership in a group that matters to them, is not to do that. It's to get to know to them and talk to them about other things and create social capital with them that you can then use, though the more clear it is you're instrumentalizing them, the less likely it is to work. You can then use to say, by the way, here's some very good evidence that this thing you believe isn't so. Yeah. And from, it makes a difference whether, and it makes a difference how you do that, right? You have to do it in a way that's respectful, which is hard because some of these views seem crazy to you.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you.
Thanks so much for the talk. I actually wanted to push a little bit on the point that Josh made earlier. So Josh was suggesting maybe there were some concerns of distributive justice for how necessary work, who became the necessary workers during the pandemic. I think I appreciate your point about not being able to solve all the problems in the midst of a disaster, but I do think it's more than just a matter of distributive justice. I think that if we're actually trying to minimize suffering and death, many of the workers we had doing the necessary work had social features that actually made them sort of least suited to be doing that work. I was in Houston for most of the pandemic, and there Hispanics were twice as likely to die than the rest of the population. And it had a lot to do with meatpacking, farm work, necessary work. If you don't speak English or have access to healthcare or have money or have a sort of a migration status that would either make you sort of comfortable trying to access healthcare or make you eligible for the pandemic money that we all got, you're going to be really poorly suited to get COVID and actually survive, in part because you're likely to go to the doctor way later than anybody else. And so in some ways, those workers were a lot like the sort of elderly worker that you were discussing in your talk who's over 60 is like, well, we understand it's necessary work, but is this who should do it? And so I think the sort of response I wanted to say to your earlier point is like, in some ways it seems like this is something that has to be done right now in order to actually minimize death and suffering. And you might think of like sort of the shock doctrine type approach, like if we don't do something about it now, when is it going to happen?
Good. Well, I mean, there are lots of things about the circumstances of those workers in Houston that it's urgent to do something about as part of the basic aim, getting them access to healthcare. Also, simply making sure that the risks associated with their work are minimized. I mean, a lot of the problems in meatpacking are actually reducible if anyone cared to reduce them. And that's the sort of place where I think the state has a central role in this kind of emergency, to come in and say, you need to make these changes in the ventilation system or whatever, and maybe we subsidize you, maybe we give you the money to do it. We spent a lot of money during the pandemic on all sorts of things. I would have thought that was an important one. But all I was suggesting is that it's difficult to figure out, meatpacking is hard and difficult work. It's also skilled work. It's not work. I mean, maybe anybody can be trained to do it, but I don't know how to do it, and it would take a while for me to get any good at it. It's not as if these people are just, as it were, could be given an unemployment payment and replaced by somebody who was safer easily. So it's not that I don't see these things as worth thinking about. It's just that thinking about them, I'm not sure what to do about them in a way that's sort of realistic in the emergency. But I think that I do think that the fact that these things have been drawn to a wider attention of a wider range of people means that we should be reorganizing those forms of work in ways that make them, in the long run, more safer, and also that the people who do them get properly paid and so on, and have access to healthcare and all those things.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for your time. I just need to apologize. I don't have any formal philosophical training. I'm a musician who's now in law school, so I ask for your indulgence with my question. You had mentioned earlier that this idea that the acts we're doing now might be delaying suffering till later, which to me seems to imply that there's a fixed quanta of suffering and all we're doing is moving it around. With this sphere idea, it seems like if the prime directive is to reduce suffering, then the logical conclusion would be to reduce the overall suffering, to concentrate it in different spheres as much as possible. And we're kind of doing that in some ways. We went from having single deployments in Vietnam amongst the whole population in a draft to multiple back-to-back-to-back deployments in the few people who volunteer. But to me, it seems like you could say that they volunteered for this when they entered this sphere, but in some effect, aren't we starting to begin to do a violence to them? I'm stuck in it seems to make sense ethically that the spheres, they've sort of quasi-signed up to it, but the end result, if you're trying to reduce suffering, would be creation of violence. I'm trying to reconcile that. I'm not sure if that was articulate, but...
So, I didn't mean to say that I thought that there was an amount of suffering that was going to happen as a result of the pandemic and we just had to shift it around. The point of flattening the curve is to reduce the overall amount of suffering. But you're interested in, not just in the overall amount of it, but the distribution of it. I mean, who as I understand it, you're interested in questions of fairness about the distribution of the burdens of dealing with the pandemic, right? And
yes.
Yes? Again, to the extent that there are, faced with a specific sphere, a specific set of questions about healthcare workers in maternity wards, say, we can ask the question, are we allocating the burdens of continuing that work? And it's necessary because some women need help having babies, and then they can't delay it. It's not delayable. It's not something you can put off till later. The baby comes when it comes. We can ask questions about the fairness of the system that's looking after the people in a maternity ward or a COVID ICU unit. We can ask those questions, and they're reasonable questions to ask, and we should be concerned about them. But it's not, I think, possible in the context of making a decision about how to do things in ICU, for example, in intensive care unit, to think of those decisions as decisions that we should make in the light of their overall impact on the total fairness of the whole system. That doesn't seem to me now, it may be that, of course, in moments like this, we can rethink, and I favor rethinking our healthcare system to make it more like the healthcare system of Costa Rica, and I think that system is fairer to health workers and to patients than our system, and it also has the added advantage that it extends people's lives, and it makes the distribution of healthcare burdens fairer because the life expectancy turns out not to be much affected by income in Costa Rica. So we have a model. It wouldn't work here for lots of reasons, but we can be motivated by that model to think about what would work here. So I think these questions about fairness arise in the sort of thinking about the design of the overall system. But I don't see how someone running an intensive care unit can be guided by that as a useful thought in the context of an emergency. I think they have to be guided by a limited range of things, and we may learn in a particular pandemic that they should be guided by something that they haven't in the past been guided by, and we can add that into the things that they consider, but we can't make them consider everything. And the overall fairness of either the American system, or for that matter of the world, isn't one of the things that I would urge to build into those decisions.
Thank you.
Not because those things don't matter, but because that isn't the way to address them, I don't think.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your lecture, and I also appreciate you sharing that the intention of your lecture was really rather narrow in scope, right? And so I'm going to try to push it just a little bit to go a little bit broader, and it's about the nature of work in general. Just from a contextual point, you know, I believe that even low-value work is valuable in and of itself, right? I remember reading years ago, and I don't have the reference in front of me, there was a large, very large refugee camp where they provided a form of basic income to everybody, and it just, you know, what sprung up from that was all sorts of crime and et cetera, right? Growing up on the east side of Detroit, there was just a well-known fact that people who did not work, who did not have even low menial jobs, would typically find things to get into even as a young man, right? If I wasn't working, I was falling into just all kind of dumb things, I'll just say. So I just wanted to get your thoughts and submit that just for correction. And the thought is that even menial, low-value work, in terms, especially in comparison to necessary work, that work is valuable in and of itself. Just working in general has value.
I mean, you were making several distinct points about the way work operates in people's lives. One point is that in many contexts in societies where work is the norm, having a job is the norm, people who don't have jobs are often dissatisfied in ways that lead them to do things that are antisocial. I'm sure that that's true, but that's a question about as it were, the bad consequences for others of their not having the job. And you were also making the point that it matters to people, to their own self-conception, perhaps. I don't know, but I think that was what you were thinking. And I agree with that up to a point, but I think the way in which work matters, there are many ways in which work matters to people. I mentioned a couple of them, but there are more. One way in which work matters to people is that it involves doing something that you think is worth doing, and you respect yourself for doing that thing that's worth doing, and other people respect you for doing that thing that's worth doing. And so jobs that are seen as you said, valuable, play a very important role in the lives of the people whose jobs they are, in sustaining what John Rawls called the social bases of self-respect. Meaningful jobs is one of those. But I'm not sure that someone's better off doing a completely meaningless job than they would be if they were given the income and not required to do the meaningless job. Sorry, when I say I'm not sure, I'm pretty sure that's not right. But whether a job is a source of value isn't, as it were, a natural fact about the job, right? Garbage disposal in some Northern European societies is regarded as an important socially contributive job, and so the people who do it are respected, and they're relatively well paid, and they have nice uniforms. And, you know, we think that, as it were, many Americans seem to think that, as it were, garbage disposal is an intrinsically something you couldn't possibly respect yourself, as it were, for doing. I don't think that's true. I think if we organize it properly, and if it's necessary, we can organize it in a way that makes it a proper source of self-respect, not an ideologically motivated desire to get people to think they're doing something useful when they aren't, but the collection of garbage is actually useful. And we shouldn't organize it in a way that means that the people who have to do this socially necessary thing can't think well of themselves. That's just not and we can change that. I mean, because some societies have. So it's humanly possible to have that. Are there forms of work that are necessary but can't be made the source of self? I don't think so, because the very fact that they're socially necessary is the sort of thing that gives them value. Now, there's lots of bullshit jobs, as David Graeber called them, and those are not socially worthwhile, and the people who don't do them don't think they're socially worthwhile, and some of them are depressed about it. And it's a lot of people think that. I mean, I don't know, 40% of people or something in some societies, if you ask them, is your job making a meaningful contribution, say no. Or at least, or I'm not sure, or something like that. Well, we can do better than that, it seems to me. Whether there are jobs that, as it were, I mean, respect for people's autonomy means that we may sometimes think that it's okay for there to be jobs where the point for the person who does them is simply that they get a good income, and they don't require or desire a sense of the value of what they're doing to sustain them. They think they get a good income, and the value in their life comes from the other 8 hours of the day when they're not at work, as it were. But I don't think we should, I'm not sure that it's necessary that there be jobs like that. And I'd be inclined to try to reduce the number of jobs like that. And in fact, most highly paid jobs, many highly paid jobs, are not just done by people who are doing them just for the money. They turn out to be being done by people who rightly or wrongly, and often wrongly, think that they're making a useful contribution. So I think meaning in work is hugely important. And work is a hugely important source of meaning for many people. I don't think, if I'd given the talk that I was advertised, I would have said that I don't think it's true that everybody needs to get their satisfaction from paid work. I do think that human beings are designed to be engaged in productive activity, and I think that what counts as productive activity is something that is shaped historically by the thinking of a society, so that it is now regarded as a productive activity. It has been since the 1950s. Well, sorry, in the 1950s it became regarded as a productive activity to throw cans of paint at canvases. And we now respect some of the people who did that very highly, and they got great satisfaction from doing it, and the people who buy those paintings think that they're something of value, and they're in all the major museums. That took a social process to make that possible. If someone had been throwing cans of paint at canvases in the time of Rembrandt, they would have been regarded as just wasting paint. And they would have said, why don't you do what he's doing, pointing to Rembrandt. So it may be that there are things that can't be made into meaningful work, but I think that whether something's meaningful work is something that is socially constructible very often, and I think it's a very important question for us that we face a society in which large numbers of people don't think that they're doing meaningful work, and a significant number of people are not being paid to do anything, that they're structurally long-term unemployed. And in a society where respect and satisfaction are connected with work and the products of work in terms of income, they're left out of the conditions of a decent life.
Thank you. You had stated that work values and personal values differ in the responsibility that you have, and also that voluntary service and mandatory service deliver different types of norms and relations. And so my question is, in any situation that requires you to lessen the loss of life or deal with life in general, wouldn't mandatory service be the best outcome? Because in my eyes, satisfaction doesn't always go hand in hand with meaningful work. Like, I see the value of, for example, the military being, to protect and to serve, right? And so when I see someone voluntarily enlist, I kind of get, like my values are kind of all over the place, because I see that personal values are dominant in that decision. And I just wanted to touch up on that, and whether, let's say in the pandemic, how effective is it to have voluntary work in those medical positions versus mandatory enrollment in those positions?
When you say in those positions, you mean in doing medical work, in doing doing the work that healthcare aides and
anything that has to do with
doctors
life
and
loss of
nurses
life.
and lab technicians and so on do.
Yes.
You think it would be better if those jobs were, if they're necessary, and presumably you're just interested in the ones that are dangerous, right?
No, the ones that deal with life in
Okay,
general.
the one, so it doesn't matter what risk is posed to the person doing the job, if a job is one that is involved in saving lives, or mitigating the mortality associated with the pandemic, then it ought to be shared by lottery or something, or anyway, shared across people and not done by volunteers. Is that the thought?
That isn't the thought. It's more of the value that that person can give.
So someone who's doing it voluntarily is giving less than someone who's forced to do it?
Not that they're giving less, but a different type of value is what I'm trying to say.
So, I can see that more clearly in the military case that you mentioned. I can see that there's something to be said for the thought that conscripts are providing a different kind of service to their society from volunteers. Is that your thought?
Yes, it is.
Yes. I think that's true. I'm not sure that I think the kind of value given by the conscripts is better than the kind of value given by the volunteers, which is, I think, your thought. But I can see that how we should think about the value of someone's offering doing military service does depend on whether they're doing it because they've chosen to, or whether they're doing it because we've required them to. But I'm not sure why you think that the required ones that it's preferable that people should do it, should be required to do it,
well,
either in the case of the military service or in the healthcare case.
Right.
It seems to me, I'd rather be treated by a doctor who wants to be treating me, I think, and I think a doctor who wants to be treating me is likely to do a better job, I guess. And anyway, you can't force people to do the
Right.
job of doctors because most of us aren't qualified to do the jobs of doctors. So we couldn't do the job.
I was kind of linking the idea with the idea that mandatory regulations in different countries were different, like had different outcomes to those that didn't have those mandatory regulations.
Of healthcare work?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know anything about that, so you'll have to... I don't know what the differences are between the different... I don't know what different regimes of regulation of healthcare work were operated in different countries. So.
No, you had stated something about Norway and Sweden.
Oh, right, but that wasn't to do with what the doctors and the nurses were required to do. That was to do with what ordinary citizens were required to do in that context. So they didn't do masking and social distancing in Sweden, and part of that was because the healthcare expert that they allowed to lead their decision making thought that it would be a good thing to. He thought that it was a good idea to aim for herd immunity by getting as many people as sick as fast as possible, and then treating them, if they needed treatment. That turned out to be, I think, a mistake. I think even he now agrees that that was a mistake. But this wasn't a difference in the things they required doctors and nurses to do. This was a difference in what they required citizens to do. And in that case, I agree with you that the compulsory system in Norway was preferable to the system in Sweden, where you were, of course, permitted to wear a mask and permitted to social distance, but you're not required to do so. And some people did. I mean, the situation would have been worse in Sweden if everybody had done what they were permitted to do. Some people wore masks, especially actually older people, which is why it didn't have as disastrous an effect as it might have.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.